James Carter had already sold the truck, the tools from his garage, his father's old watch, and the small house he and his daughter Lily had lived in for 6 years, and still, somehow it wasn't enough. Because 6-year-old Lily Carter had been diagnosed 8 months earlier, with a rare and aggressive form of childhood leukemia, and while the initial rounds of chemotherapy had been partially covered by James's modest construction worker insurance, the experimental treatment her specialists now recommended, a targeted cell therapy available at only a handful of hospitals in the country, cost nearly $400,000, a number so far beyond anything James could imagine that for the first few weeks after hearing it, he simply went numb, unable to process it, and James, a single father since Lily's mother had left when Lily was only 2 years old, unable to handle the pressure of a difficult marriage, had spent the last 4 years building a quiet, steady life for just the two of them, working long hours pouring concrete and framing houses, coaching Lily's tiny soccer team on weekends, and falling asleep most nights on the couch beside her hospital bed once the diagnosis came. And by the time Lily's oncologist, a compassionate but overworked doctor named Dr. Ellis, first mentioned the experimental treatment, James had already liquidated almost everything he owned that could be turned into cash, the truck he needed for work, sold to a coworker for a fraction of its worth, his late father's tools, sold to a pawn shop 2 towns over, so nobody he knew would see him doing it, his father's watch, the one thing he'd sworn he would never part with, sold quietly online to a stranger for $1,100, and finally, unable to keep up with both rent and mounting medical bills, James had sold the small house, moving himself and Lily into a cramped extended-stay motel room 10 minutes from the hospital. And even after all of that, after every last thing of value James Carter had ever owned had been converted into cash and poured into his daughter's treatment fund, he was still nearly $200,000 short, and standing in a hospital hallway one exhausted evening in early November, having just hung up with a fundraising coordinator who gently explained that the online donation page James had built, despite his best efforts, had raised barely $11,000 in 3 months. James found himself sitting alone in a plastic chair outside Lily's room, head in his hands, quietly breaking down in a way he had never once allowed himself to do in front of his daughter. And it was in that exact moment, in that empty, fluorescent-lit hallway at nearly 9 o'clock at night, that an older man in a plain gray cardigan, carrying a small paper cup of vending machine coffee, sat down in the chair beside him without a word, waited a long moment, and then asked quietly, "Rough night?" And James, too tired to explain politely, simply said, "My daughter's sick and I've sold everything I own trying to save her, and it still isn't enough." And the older man, who introduced himself simply as Walter, sat with James in silence for a while before asking gently what kind of treatment Lily needed. And James, assuming Walter was just another exhausted family member killing time in the hallway, explained the situation plainly. The diagnosis, the experimental cell therapy, the impossible cost, and Walter listened carefully, asked a few quiet, specific questions about which hospital was administering the treatment and which specialist was overseeing it. And then, after a long pause, said something that struck James as strange at the time. "I know a little about how hospitals like this one work, more than most people would guess," and James, assuming Walter meant he'd simply spent a lot of time as a patient's family member himself, thanked him for listening, and eventually made his way back into Lily's room, not thinking much more of the brief conversation until 3 days later, when Dr. Ellis pulled James aside after morning rounds with an unusually careful expression and said, "James, I need to ask you something. Do you know a man named Walter Hensley?" And James, confused, said he'd only met a Walter briefly in the hallway a few nights earlier. And Dr. Ellis explained, choosing her words carefully, that Walter Hensley was in fact the retired founder of Hensley Regional Health Systems, the very hospital network that operated the facility Lily was being treated in, a man who had built the network from a single struggling rural clinic 40 years earlier into one of the largest nonprofit hospital systems in the region before stepping back from day-to-day leadership 5 years earlier following his own wife's long illness. And Dr. Ellis said that Walter had personally called the hospital's foundation office the morning after speaking with James, asking detailed questions about Lily's case, and that the foundation's charitable care committee, an internal fund most patients never even knew existed because it wasn't publicly advertised to avoid being overwhelmed with requests, had reviewed Lily's file that same day. And James, stunned, asked why any of this mattered, and Dr. Ellis, with the faintest hint of a relieved smile, said, "Because as of this morning, the Foundation has approved full coverage of Lily's experimental treatment. All of it, through the Charitable Care Fund," and James, standing in that hospital corridor, felt his knees genuinely go weak. Gripping the wall beside him as Dr. Ellis continued explaining that Walter had specifically requested the approval be processed quietly, without publicity, without his name attached anywhere in the paperwork James would see, and that the only reason Dr. Ellis was even telling James who was behind it was because hospital policy required disclosing the funding source to the patient's guardian, though Walter had asked that it go no further than that. And later that same afternoon, as James sat by Lily's bedside trying to process everything, still barely able to speak, Walter Hensley appeared quietly in the doorway again, this time without his paper coffee cup, and said simply, "I heard congratulations are in order," and James, overwhelmed, immediately began trying to thank him, to explain that he didn't understand why a stranger would do something like this, and Walter, sitting down slowly in the same chair by the bed, said, "I'm not a stranger doing something extraordinary, James. I'm just a man who built something 40 years ago because my own son was sick once, and there wasn't a fund like this to help us, and we lost him, and every single day since, I've tried to make sure fewer families ever have to sit in a hallway feeling the way you looked feeling the other night." And James, hearing this, understood for the first time that Walter's quiet kindness in that hallway hadn't been an accident or a coincidence. It had been the entire reason Walter still visited hospital hallways at all these years, after stepping back from running the network, quietly looking for exactly the kind of exhausted, broken parent he had once been himself. And over the following weeks, as Lily began her treatment fully covered, no longer a source of crushing financial terror hanging over every single day, James found himself getting to know Walter better, learning that Walter visited Hensley hospitals almost weekly, sitting in waiting rooms and hallways not as a wealthy donor making appearances, but simply as an ordinary old man in a cardigan, listening to exhausted families, and quietly flagging cases to the Foundation's care committee when he found families who had genuinely exhausted every option. And Walter, when James finally asked him directly why he did it this way, anonymously, sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs instead of simply running the Foundation from an office, said, "Because the moment people know who I am, they stop talking to me like a person and start talking to me like a wallet. And I don't want to be a wallet, James. I want to actually hear people the way I wish someone had heard me 40 years ago." And James, listening to this, thought about his own instinct. All those months to sell everything quietly, privately, without asking anyone for help until he absolutely had no other choice, and realized that Walter's quiet dignity and his own were, in a strange way, cut from the exact same cloth. The treatment, over the following 4 months, worked better than even Dr. Ellis had initially hoped. And on a bright, cold morning in March, James Carter stood beside Lily's hospital bed as Dr. Ellis delivered the words he had prayed for every single night since the diagnosis, that Lily's most recent scan showed no detectable signs of disease, that she was, for the first time in nearly a year, officially in remission, and Lily, 6 years old and only half understanding the full weight of the moment, simply asked if this meant she could finally go back to soccer practice, and James, laughing through tears for the first time in longer than he could remember, said, "Yes, baby, you can absolutely go back to soccer practice." And that same week, as James and Lily prepared to leave the hospital for good, Walter came to see them off, and James, still without the words to properly thank him, simply hugged the older man tightly, and Walter, patting his back gently, said, "You don't owe me anything, James. Just do for someone else someday what I got to do for you. That's the only repayment I've ever wanted." And true to that, over the following 2 years, James Carter, having rebuilt his life slowly, moving into a small rented house with Lily, going back to steady construction work, began quietly volunteering 1 evening a week at the very same hospital, not with any money to give, but with time, sitting in waiting rooms, listening to exhausted parents the way Walter once listened to him. And one evening, nearly 2 years after that first conversation in the hallway, James found himself sitting beside a young single mother whose son had just been diagnosed with a serious illness, watching her hands shake as she tried to explain the financial impossibility of the treatment her son needed. And James, remembering exactly how it had felt to sit in that same hallway feeling utterly alone, gently told her about the hospital's charitable care fund, walked her personally to the Foundation office the next morning, and stayed with her the entire time and later that night, driving Lily home from soccer practice, now a healthy, energetic 8-year-old chattering about her team's win. James glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter's bright, laughing face and thought about Walter. About the son Walter had lost decades earlier. About the quiet, invisible chain of kindness that had started with one grieving father's loss and had somehow, 40 years later, reached down a hospital hallway to save his own daughter's life. And James understood more clearly than he ever had before that the truest kind of wealth was never the money itself. It was what a person chose to quietly do with it when no one else was watching. And that sometimes, the stranger sitting beside you in your very worst moment isn't a stranger at all. They're simply someone who once sat exactly where you're sitting now, and never forgot what it felt like.